Welcome back. So I hope that you really enjoyed watching The Children Who Built Victorian Britain, those parts. And of course, if you're so inclined, please do go back and watch all of the parts. They're so fascinating, so interesting. And it's really odd to think that it's out of this era that the stories that we tell today really did originate. Last time we talked about what is a child, and I wanted to delve more deeply into this concept of it being a social conception. It's also a physiological process and stage in one's life, as I'm sure you're well aware. Let's look at these perspectives now in order to understand a little bit better about what the child is. And so in the first discussion board, I'm asking you to examine this more closely and just to, contribute your own 2 cents to what you think children are today and how it differs so much from the past. Here's some of the major contexts that we have to consider when we analyze the child. So we have to look at the social aspect here, which would be relationships with adults, peers, families, schools, and we'll refer to this quite a bit when we look at the tale Cinderella as it relates to males and females, which I just love that we get that same kind of theme that arises in Harry Potter as well. And then we're going to look at the cultural context here, values, customs, shared understanding, the stories that we share, the identities that we share, as far as our cultural identities. Um, and then the socioeconomic context, such as education, money, jobs, opportunities, access to opportunities, and so on and so forth. And we'll see that in Harry Potter as well. We'll also see a bit of that in Alice in Wonderland, but I don't want to get ahead of myself. Children think differently than adults. They perceive the world through a different lens, and I think these contexts really help to explain just why that is. So, regardless of our perception of them, their perception of the world, ha ha ha, oh no, it's not letting me edit. This is a saved document, sorry. Anyways, their perception of the world is different than ours is. And some of this is due to that's what I meant on this slide, their biology. For example, children learn to see over a period of time from birth to 24 months. So even something as basic as just perception, remember we create children's literature for babies as well. And so even this has to do with the phase of development that they're in at this point. From birth to 4 months, children are unable to see well. Their focus is on objects maybe 8 to 10 inches from their face. Otherwise, they really can't see you. At 1 month, their eyes are not well coordinated and they kind of appear to wander all over the place. By 2 months, their eyes more easily can focus on nearby faces. And by 3 months, they can follow moving objects and begin to reach for things. 5 to 8 months, they're starting to get depth perception, good color vision. By 8 months, they start crawling, developing eye, hand, and foot coordination. By 9 months, they're pulling themselves up to practice standing, right? They're strengthening those legs for walking. And by 10 months, they're grasping objects with a thumb and forefinger. By 12 months, they're crawling and trying to walk and can judge distance pretty well. They can throw with precision. And we can take from all of this the fact that the faculties that they attain over time, they're not born with them fully developed. And they acquire them. And much like they acquire these physical faculties and physical abilities, they also acquire intellectual abilities, right? They grow, and they grow exponentially at very early ages. Their perception, their intellectual perception and visual perception develops alongside their faculties. And this affects the way that they see the world and the literature that's created for them. And like I was saying, this is why it's so important for inclusion to take place here, because once that can happen, it's then that children can really see and understand that I'm in the world. I'm as much a part of this world as everyone else, and I'm just as important. Um, Children's literature is less than 200 years old, which means that what we're looking at here is a relatively new phenomenon in the genre of literature. Books for children were unknown until about the 18th century, and the children's book industry didn't even begin to flourish until the second half of the 19th century. So remember, when publications were becoming more prominent, when color print was becoming possible, by this time, adult literature had already been established for well over 100 years. Children were once viewed as these, miniature adults walking around before the idea of children was created and then widely accepted as a distinct time period in one's life. The 20th century is the most obsessive of the concept of childhood and its values, and its issues, including psychological, physical, and sexual. We really consider it the most important time period in one's life, and that is also a relatively new concept. It wasn't considered to be the case before, but Freud has even contributed to that notion that the rest of our adult lives are kind of the pictures painted by the experiences that we had as children, and either trying to recreate them, relive them constantly, or run from them. And we believe this so much so that even in today's psychology, we often explain adult behavior in terms of childhood experiences. Before the 17th century, the child wasn't even perceived as a distinct entity from the adult. I just can't emphasize that enough. They weren't perceived to have special needs and desires that need to be fostered and fulfilled and sheltered and encouraged. So there was really no established educational system either. During the Middle Ages, the life cycle was perceived as analogous to nature: birth, life, death, and there was really no phase in between called childhood. Plus, kids had poor chances of survival due to the high mortality rate. So living conditions also played a major role here in the concept of a child. People got married very early on. Upper class children took an active part in society within the ages of 10 to 13, and lower classes entered the workforce as soon as they were able, which I told you could be as young as 5 years old. Unity prevailed in all aspects of physical and psychic needs between adults and children. So really around the age of 3, children were wearing miniature versions of adult clothing. So we're talking button-down shirts, suits, suit coats, vests. I mean, this is what children were wearing: formal dresses, tights, girdles, all that stuff. Something as simple as clothing later became a symbol of the separation of the world of children from that of adults. Children now have there's a complete separate market for everything for children. Many factors contributed to the polarization of the worlds of adults and children. The Industrial Revolution, which is what The Children Who Built Victorian Britain covers, decreased mortality rate, right? Better medicine, better births, child labor legislation, which came, as you know, from The Children Who Built Victorian Britain, out of a rise of building Britain using child slavery. And the educational system, the formal educational system, schools, is what helped to separate the idea of adults and children. As literature evolved for children, there were 2 schools of motive, and we're coming back to this: to entertain and to educate. Perrault wanted to entertain, okay? All of the Brothers Grimm versions of these tales that you'll hear is because they were aimed to educate children. They were there was a lesson involved. They were trying to warn them, scare them into doing the right things. In the beginning of the 19th century, folk tales were really kept from kids. And as a result of the use of fantasy, which was thought to actually corrupt kids, the use of fantasy is something that we see now is really relatively new. The educational establishment during that time really preferred realistic texts. And in the second half of the 19th century, fantasy was no longer considered harmful. It was actually accepted and celebrated as a normal aspect of child development. It became something that they saw as being very corrupting. Now it had become something that was ultimately necessary, a vital part of child development in order for children to thrive. And as a result, we began to see all of these new additions of folk tales and fairy tales, which is what you are familiar with now. So we're going to look at Red Riding Hood and right after this, and I'm really excited to talk to you about this because I think there are a lot of things that you're going to note here. I want you to pay particular attention to anything that you did not notice before. And we've got to read the alternate version. So please, before you go any further, make sure that you actually read all the versions, including the one that I posted for you in the Blackboard course entitled The Story of Grandmother. I know that you have this version in your book, but this one is a different version of that other version in your book. And this one is one that I want to focus on because it has some details. It dates back to France. So it's 1885 is where it dates back to, from rural France. And I want you to take a look at that version first because I'm going to use it as really the model for breaking down this story. Now, Perrault's version is the best version of Little Red Riding Hood known in English. Okay, so you're going to read that version as well in your book. But the title is from the Brothers Grimm, which is dating back to 1812. So that's more than 100 years later than Perrault's original version. This gives us the moral lesson at the end. And unfortunately, we see this removed from the text in some versions of the text. So sometimes the lesson is there, sometimes the lesson is not. You'll note that you will have some of the lessons in different versions of stories in your current text that you're using for this class.